So Linnet, because that's important. Linnet has been doing CYPE, which is the big human understanding project. I don't know if you're aware of it or if you've followed it.
Yeah.
Okay, CYPE is the largest knowledge base in the world in terms of basically he's tried to create rule-based rules for common sense. Like, what do we know? What's the non-obvious knowledge that we know that we don't even realize we know because it's so obvious? And
could you spell that, or what is that?
Like CYC.
CYC,
and I think it's there's an open site which is just the ontology, but as he said, the ontology is not the important part. It's the rules that are important. That's not open. And, I think it's psych.org simply, and the name is Doug Linnet, Doug L-E-N-A-T. He's pretty easy to find. He's kind of the oldest, not old, one of the most important old school AI. He's been working on this CYPE project for nearly 40 years, 37. It's huge, and it's got an amazing collection of, and it can actually do pretty impressive real world reasoning. Like, you can ask it questions about like non-obvious inferences, fact inference. And one thing he said that's really interesting is, obviously he had to go into higher order logic to get the real inference he wants. He has a higher order logic prover that is too slow and he doesn't use. He's basically unplugged it. Most of the work is done by micro theories. Like, we're in this domain, in this context, these are the kind of rules, some of them certain, some of them heuristic, that are known to work. And then the system can compute pretty high level inference from these micro theories of, and that includes, you know, complex stuff such that X knows that Y knows that, you know, these inferred knowledge. And it can because it's rule based, it can meta reason a lot. It's like, how do you know this? Or sometimes the expert can say, oh, how come you didn't get to that conclusion? Well, here are plausible facts that I don't know for certain. If I had known them for certain, I could have made that inference. And so the expert can say, yes, that one is true. You can use that as a basis for your next reasoning. So there's a lot of very, very cute high-level stuff. And it is higher order logic. And one thing that I found really interesting is, of course, it's a hypergraph in the sense that he's using higher level tuples, not triples, something very much like frames. So that way, FrameNet, and what Tal's doing is consistent. Tal should look into that. But the other thing that's really interesting, local consistency, not global consistency, yay. But he said, you know, the problem with that is that's kind of high level and hard to compute. And then you've got the low level stuff that's easy to compute, but not that useful. And basically he said what he does now is compile the high level rules to lower level rules. And that's how he can get performance and expressivity. So he's got a kind of probably first order logic low-level system, but he compiles the higher order to that. I'm really curious to read the scientific articles about that now. So this is, you know, he's had a team for ages, for 40 years working on this. We won't do this in our lonesome. And he's a brilliant researcher, but there's definitely lessons to learn in there. Of course, this is with the higher goal, higher in mind, of natural reasoning, rule-based natural reasoning. But still, it's very interesting what he had to do and what he used to achieve natural reasoning in terms of data representation. The data representation, as I said, is tuple-based and rule-based. So are rules like arguments? Good question for us. Certainly, there's no question that tuples, and he's basically making the point. The other thing is you don't want to be coding in machine language. That is, you don't want to be coding in triples. Tuples are more expressive, more efficient, more everything, which is obvious to me. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff. And don't expect global consistency was another thing. Yes, that's not going to happen. So that was a fascinating thing. He went a lot into the, if you have a very poor ontology, then you can distinguish your things. But if you have a very rich ontology, there's more than one way to say things, and then you need more inference rules to establish the correspondences between those, and that's costly in its own right. So he's saying it's not that important to get the ontology exactly right. We found out that equivalent ontologies can do, but there's a right granularity for the ontology. That was really interesting. For the middle ontology, but local context, local microtheories is the way he goes, and that again, yes, that makes sense. But what defines a context is unclear. Before that, we had one of the fathers of RDF explain some of the stuff that was supposed to be an RDF early on that didn't make it. Disagree with some of what he was saying, but there was some interesting insights. I was very happy to hear him diss schema.org. I hate schema.org with passion. It's totally ad hoc. What's useful to Google to a search engine that wants to sell you stuff, as opposed to a search engine that wants to understand the world. What else is there to know? No, that was the essential.
Awesome.
Questions?
I can't think of any.
I just, I don't, what do you call this field, and like what are these their end goals? I don't have that general context of what it is. An argumentation theory. It's knowledge.
Artificial intelligence, really? That's the field of classical AI, as opposed to classical AI is what I would call it.
Okay.
Expert systems are one case of it, and rule-based system. Yeah, it's a classic. Symbolic AI is another name for it, as opposed to deep learning and purely numerical machine learning, big data. But yeah, symbolic AI, I think, is the best term for it. Symbolic reasoning is also used sometimes, but yeah, that's the field.
Is there ever discussion on whether or not it's the right approach? That there always is, but was there the conference? Is there
it's
high-level discussions of where we're going with this?
See, it's very interesting because everybody gave up on rule-based AI because rules, like if you try to have absolute consistency, rules are brittle. And few people are willing, like few logicians are willing to abandon consistency. And I think that's one of the, and working without it is difficult. It's brittle in another way, right? So that way, Leonard is a bit of a lone ranger with his microtheory approach. There was a lot of success with expert systems in the early days, and they're still used in some fields. Like there's still people in medicine, but all the oxygen was sucked out of that field when machine learning and then deep learning started getting really successful.
In one perspective, it's essentially the approach of chipping away piece by piece at something that has kind of infinite facets. Yeah. So how long are you going to keep covering all the holes that you find? On the other hand, handing it over to something where you just don't really understand what's going on, and it's an analogy to how the brain works, but that isn't really how the brain works, is also, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the explainability of Leonard's work. The fact that you can say, okay, why do you believe that? What's the chain of reasoning? There's counterfactual. Okay, if we remove that fact, then you still make that conclusion. And what conclusions can you make without that fact? It's brilliant. I mean, there's a lot. It's very much the anti-black box.
Exactly, yeah.
And you know, it's people gave up because it was tough, and the reality is a lot of AI is developed either by big proprietary companies, and that's one discussion that the other guy, what's his name, the other guy was making is we have the history of these big monoliths hidden in companies, private monoliths, and small public projects. I mean, so much of the innovation is done in universities, but universities means you have a small budget, a few students, a few years, and then you have to move on to the next topic, right? You cannot sustain that kind of effort in an academic, like unless you manage to get a research group in a chair and this and that, it happens. But still, university is not a good milieu for the kind of sustained effort that someone like Doug Lennon has done. And sorry, I'm really feeling awful about not forgetting his name is important. Handler was very much making the point, we have to accept that the reality is a bunch of monoliths and a bunch of small things, and they have to interoperate, because the monolith alone won't solve it. The small things alone won't solve it. Reality is always a mix of big and small. And if you look at the other great success of AI in recent years, it was the original Watson, not the Watson that IBM is selling now, which is boring deep learning as far as I'm concerned, but the Watson that solved Jeopardy. That it was a hybrid of symbolic and numerical AI. And I totally believe in that. I don't believe it's going to be just symbolic or just numeric. I believe in hybrids. One thing about the brain is, one of the early AI architecture that Jack told me about was something called Pandemonium, which was a bunch of agents making proposals about deductions, and then there's a kind of overseeing scoring agent that's okay, this seems to be the direction most small stupid agents are going into, so let's make that the overall conclusion, right? A kind of weighted vote over stupid micro agents, which makes sense to me. Again, like if you have micro theories, then you see, okay, which micro theory is applicable, and then you ask which is the agent. You actually have the agents say not only this is my score, but this is my certainty score. I think I'm relevant to this, and this is what I have to say. And when you have many, well, it's worth investigating and pondering and doing the work of sending the higher cognitive guns. This is what happens in the brain, right? We've got these automatisms that give us answers. And when there's multiple automatisms that give different answers, we stop and think. Hopefully, sometimes. But the notion is there's multiple answers and multiple mechanisms. And that's another reason I'm so, has to be an ecosystem. It's also a vision of diversity as a key feature of intelligence. Whether between brains or inside the brain. There's a lot of microcircuitry in the brain. So anyway, so that's all speculation. I don't know, like there were these big articles about symbolic versus numerical AI. None of them, like a lot of them list advantages and disadvantages. None of them convinced me that there was a theoretical reason why one should win and not the other. Certainly, because the computing power is there, launching a numeric AI on a bunch of data, because the data is there and the computing power is there, Of course, that's less work intensive than crafting rules for 40 years. But the crafting rules for 40 years finally yields results. And for me, that's, results speak. And yeah, it took 40 years. That doesn't seem abusive to me. I mean, this kind of work. But again, my goal is a bit less ambitious than that. Thank God.
I wonder if
Yeah.
we could shift gears and
Yes.
y'all would indulge me in taking a look at the changes I've made to Golibot recently, and maybe even the explanation of the scoring mechanism, and see if it makes sense to you guys. Don't mind doing that?
Sure. I'm not as ready.
You want
as
us
I wish I
to
was.
read the explanation? I think we should read it rather than
Yeah.
you reading
I
it
can
to
pull
us.
it up. So yeah, so I made this post on like how the scores work. And trying to keep it short, so y'all can just read it. The last one is probably the worst one as far as explanation, so you could probably
Yes.
ignore that. But
Yeah, this is the one that bothers me because, like, why is it more or less important? Like everything else, you make a kind of promise of transparency, and the last one, if it's not justified, you're breaking that promise.
oh, so that's a good point. Yeah. So let's ignore that one. Does all this other stuff kind of seem to
Yes.
make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. The biggest problem in before was that people were like, well, how did Golibot score that? And it's like, Golibot just believes it. So I had to kind of explicitly write out Golibot will score it at 100% true until someone tells it otherwise.
It's
So
a
I just had to keep
defeasibility
making-
logic.
Yeah. As far as this one, when you're adding a child claim beneath it, and that claim would cut the weight in half or multiply the weight by 2, depending on whether you're saying it's supporting or opposing. And then you can debate the truth of that claim. But there is a written claim that says why we're creating it, why it should be more important or why it shouldn't be more important. And that is open to debate. It's really similar to our relevance attack.
Right.
Which is really what it is. Yeah. That's just how it affects the scoring.
Actually, that I'm a bit curious about that. What you're saying is, if the argument if it's attacked, you decrease the score. Do you decrease it always by half, or I don't know?
Well, so there's two attacks. One is saying it's untrue, and one is saying it's not as relevant. And so if it's not true, then it averages all the scores beneath it. So if you just have one reason why it's untrue, then it's considered false until you have some evidence that it's true. But if you're attacking the relevance, yeah, right now, just by default, the system cuts it in half if you're attacking the relevance, which is not a great solution. But the theory is then you can increase the weight of that one to say, oh, here's why it's more and more important.
Why not use the same logic? That is, if there's one attack on the relevance, cut it, and if there's attack and support, you do the average. You could have attack and support of the relevance and do the average. So it's the same logic.
Yeah, the main reason I came to that is not really a good thing, but is that also there's times that we want to say that this claim is more important than the others. And there's not a So the idea was I would multiply by 2 if you're saying this is more important.
Yeah.
And so it was the opposite of that. And honestly, it doesn't matter in my system whether you're attacking the relevance or confidence. So if you want to word a relevance attack and put it as a truth claim, it would then have that same effect. So I didn't have a need for that. It's just not in the structure.
I'm a bit, yeah, relative importance is really hard to do right and transparently. But certainly I agree. Like we spoke about prove, sufficient versus not sufficient, like proof versus support. And we should certainly be able to say this is circumstantial evidence, right? Like if we say all A are B and here's a that's a B, that's circumstantial evidence. It's interesting, but it doesn't prove anything.
Yeah. Yeah, so an example in here, I think, did I take it out? No, 5%. Oh, so here's one at 200% because that one is, and we're still working on the wording, but it's at 200% because it has a claim that says, oh, this is more important than the other ones in the list.
So out of curiosity, go up.
Open up the higher ones.
No, go. Okay, you're at the top. Okay, base -5 minus 200 times 2. So there's other, this is just the first argument, right? Okay, is there a score on the top claim?
Yeah, I'm not posting it, so it's listed here. It's at 85%.
Here, 85, okay. Okay.
Just because people get confused by it if it's listed out.
Okay, and
yeah, so the top layer is that 3 completely true, a con that's partially true, and a con that's barely true.
So
well, true confidence, not true, but
38. 300 moins 38 divisé par 5. 280. Yeah, it seems to me that's not a pure average, right?
No.
Right. So how do you do it?
Well, so as the scores get closer to 0%, their weight reduces. There's a term for that, but I can't think of it. So if this one was at 0% impact, when you average them together, you're not averaging an extra 0 for a fifth of the weight. It actually has 0 weight.
Oh, so those are weights really. It's +1 with weight 99%, +1 with 99%, +1 with weight 99%, well, -1 with weight 33%, -1 with weight 5%.
So not exactly. So it is a negative 0.33 with a weight of 0.33. Well, this is a +1 with a weight of 1.
Yeah.
I try not to end up explaining all that, but yeah.
Okay, so but yeah.
It makes sense with the way you think of things, that if something has no truth value to it, should have no impact on the score. But if it was an average 0, it would drag everything towards the middle.
Well, actually what I'm seeing is, if I were writing this, there would be 2 numbers. In the sense, I would separate relevance.
If only humans could accept that. So there's another way
tried,
that
I guess that question you've tried.
Yeah, well, yeah. So there's a different way to display it, the scores, which is fractionalized, and this works out a little better. So it has +30, +30, +30, and then a -3, and then a 0. And this is kind of the weights. And if you add that up, you get 85, except for some rounding every once in a while. 3690 -3. It's 2 points off.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's a little bit better. The problem with that is you get the 0 one in here, and because it's whatever fraction it is of the main one, everything just comes up 0. So
Yeah.
once again, you need two numbers to say.
Oh, the numbers beneath are normalized to the total weight of the
Yeah.
argument.
Yeah.
Ouch. Makes sense. I understand why, but
Yeah,
yeah.
it's just once you get something that's been made a myth or something like that. Plus the numbers get so small that this is a fraction and you don't want to show fractions and stuff. So there's no easy way to represent it. So yeah, I'm kind of hand wavy using this scoring system because I don't bother. But I think people get the idea that the higher the number, the more the impact it has.
Yeah.
And maybe it needs to just be a symbol. Like we have this kind of lines. Well, this one's not so good, but you can see based on where these dots are on the scale, kind of tells you I need to change those in arrows because they're dragging the score to the right or to the left. So lots of different ways to visualize it. I actually want to make several visualizations. Anyways.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's entirely possible that what I'm aiming at is way too complicated with two numbers.
But you're absolutely right. And I probably need to make a view that explicitly
you need an expert mode.
those.
You need an expert mode because some people will want to see the math, and that should be possible.
Yes. I'm trying to think. No, I don't have that yet. So yeah, I've been mainly, that's a good point.
Yeah. Basically, you need to show the math on demand. I understand you don't want to show it all the time, but you need to show the math on demand. People like me will care, and let's face it, you need both expert and non-expert users, mathy and non-mathy people to be on board. And the point of exposing the math is, again, this is the promise of transparency, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're saying you'll be transparent about this. Well, yep, that's a promise you have to keep.
Yeah, because the math explanation and the score explanation doesn't even go into that level of detail, so that's definitely not transparent.
So yeah, you need to
add that.
The formula has to be there. I strongly believe any scoring has to be visible. It's part of the trustability.
Now the code is open source. Maybe I should just link to that. But I can't think of a way to mathematically, and maybe you can help me with this, a mathematical way to express that in a formula that people that are more used to. I mean, I can write out. The code still gets pretty complex. Well,
see, I think it's easy if you, in the math version, I think having the two numbers would make sense.
Yeah, I've often thought about putting it to where they're actually side by side and it shows like, looks like a elementary school paper +5 months, right? And then has the total. So yeah, I'll put that on my to-do list.
Yeah.
Cool. I appreciate y'all taking the time to focus on my specific project.
Listen, you're
I mean, the main thing for me is like, I just don't, when I look at it at a glance, it's not so easy to know what's going on, right? I guess these are all top level arguments, right? Reduce the spread, that's neat. Zoom into the -5%.
Okay.
More info. Yeah.
I think there's more down there. Unfortunately, there's a lot here.
Purple just always means that somehow it's in favor of the top conclusion.
Yeah, if you think of it like purple team versus orange team, the two sides of the argument.
Yeah.
I thought that was easier than explaining to them this is a pro to its parent, which may or may not be a pro.
Right.
So I think
that's
people think
a
it's
classic problem.
yeah.
Yeah, I once made a color scheme where I had like pros and cons to be a certain color and the con to be another color, basically.
I think the team analogy people seem to understand after a while. And no one notices that these little speech bubbles are like left and to the right. It'd be nice to make them bigger, but then it doesn't work on cell phones.
Nice.
It took me a while to notice, but then I noticed.
And you would think that you could like make them be on the left side of the screen and on the right side of the screen. The problem with that is that then you also have a hierarchy of space here. So
yeah, no, that's the right choice.
I probably do need to have an explanation up here. That's a good point, is I should add the color thing. Yeah. I mean, I think most of the time people end up figuring it out because of the minuses and the pluses. But
by the way, you seem to assume that all arguments are either for or against unambiguously. I was looking at the emergency use authorization, could be interpreted either pro or con, right?
So I would say that if a claim cannot be determined whether it's for or against, then it's a badly worded claim. And since this is a curated document, there won't be any in there. So the claim should be said, it is a good thing that X, right?
Right.
And then you're making the claim, and you can have the alternate claim saying that's a bad thing. But to just
my understanding is that that's always linked arguments. Or there's a missing premise there. Mm-hmm. So it's usually and, or because, like the Trump wall thing. Trump built a wall. And
right.
uh-huh.
Yeah. Yes. So this isn't a community curated tool, so we're able to sidestep that issue for now.
Mm-hmm. By the way, did you have thoughts, Tim, on what I said? Sorry to change the topic if you're okay. I started speaking about the value of finally linked claim units because of argument schemes. And as a way to say, well, maybe we want multi-premise arguments after all. Do you have thoughts about that?
I didn't quite understand it.
Yeah, sorry.
Can you go through it again step by step so I can follow?
Oh, yeah. This is something I want. Okay, so argument schemes are. I remember you're asking. Yes, Wednesday. I did listen a bit to the conversation, the recording. It's things such as you said, argument from expert opinion, argument from ad populum, argument, like all these different cases of using this, using that. And again, some of them can be perfectly valid, some of them are more dubious. And for each argument scheme, there's multiple premises and multiple angles of attack. An important point about the classification of argument schemes is that they allow you to identify the possible angles of attack on any of the arguments. So they're useful. For me, they're out of scope certainly for quite a while, but it's something I'd like to see in scope someday. What is more important is that they show that a future refinement might find it useful to distinguish the role of different premises, different roles for different premises. So that way, the linked arguments, if there's inner structure to the premises, that is, this premise plays this role, that premise plays this other role, they're not interchangeable. That means the argument from linked premises has an inner structure that is not just given by the arguments as a compound. I still believe in compound claims. Sorry, the premises as a compound claim. I still believe in compound claims. Maybe we'll need both. But
my understanding of compound claims was that the compound claim was an abstract class that, you know, different expressions, concrete classes would provide a different structure.
Yeah, that's correct.
So,
but it was also a way to have single premise arguments. An artifact to have single premise arguments. That reason never sat with me. Like the fact that compound claims exist, and there's a reason to have compound claim. First, because we might discover the composition post hoc, and then, you know, we have a linguistic claim, and then as we formalize it, we realize it's actually a compound. So compounds need to exist, if only for that reason. Another reason is I'm realizing there's compound claims sometimes in conclusions. You know, from this premise, we could draw either this or that conclusion. Sometimes it's a dilemma in the sense of a mutual negation, but sometimes it's more than that. Though I'm still hunting, for example, a concrete example of that, to be honest. Compound claims have a reason to exist, but I still think one reason we had for them was to avoid multi-premise argument, and now I'm thinking that's actually an anti-goal, because if someday we want to do argumentation schemes, that means the application of the argumentation scheme is not only a multi-premise argument, but a multi-premise argument where different premises play different roles, which is important because they'll be attacked by different defeaters. Rebuttals in the Tolman's terms. So yeah, I'm kind of reintroducing multi-premise argument. And of course, this is the whole debate with Stephen.
Let's pause here a second.
Yeah, let's pause. Go.
I think I understood what you're saying, and I think I understood the distinction, and I recognize that distinction. But let me see if I got this right in my language, which is the thing about compound claims, and especially when you're talking about, you know, an and or a math or something like that, is it all, the formula around it all relates to the truth, the underlying truth of the premise, which is, you know, this and that. Well, it's not true if not this, right? And that sort of thing. But an argument scheme, some of the premises that play a role affect what I call the relevance, which is the support, which is, yes, this person said that, but the question is how much of an authority are they on that, which means how much does that thing that they truthfully said apply to the conclusion. And so in an argument scheme, you have parts that play a role about the truth of the statement, but you also have parts that play a role as far as its impact or its relevance or its validity as an argument.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's believability or whatever. No, that's interesting. Yes, go on.
Well, I mean, that's the end. That's how I'm interpreting and adapting what you said.
Right.
Because I see, you know, I've seen multi-premise up to now as being a combination of things that together affect how true it is, and not in terms of how strong an argument it is.
I would say that the point I'm making about argument schemes would hold even if all parts were about truth.
And that's the part I don't quite see, because I mean, I see that and also think that in that case it could be solved just by compound claims. That's where I'm on the fence.
I think the point that is being made, and I should dig into specific examples, I think it would be worth it. And many of the examples like I look for there's something about goals, for example, and when you get about goals, this is not about truth anymore. It's about something else. In fact, altogether, I did say always a teleological layer was distinct from the truth layer. So there, I'm with you totally. Let's take the classic Socrates argument. We have a minor and major premise in classical rhetoric, right? Because the universal claim is a major premise. And the way you attack the minor premise and the major premise is different. That's kind of the point. Like when you attack a major premise, you ask for exceptions to the general rule. Are there other exceptions? When you attack the minor premise was that person really part of that class? Was that person, could that person have been something else? Blah, blah, blah. Could that individual be a member of another class? Does it fall under the major premise? So the idea is that how you attack the premise depends on what the premise is. Now, in this case, it's the fact that it plays a role is actually less relevant than the nature of the premise. Like what is a universal claim? What is an individual claim? And of course, you'd attack an individual claim differently than a universal claim. So you know what? You're right. I need to look into specific argument schemes and see if there's a case where the defeaters really are specific to the role and not the nature of the premise. But this notion of nature of the premise is new too. Not like we've discussed that before. The saying,
well,
oh,
the appeal to authority case or argument by authority. Is that a case of that? That's kind of what I was thinking, where
it's an argument scheme. Certainly.
In other words, the impact of the argument hinges on how much of an authority this person is on that subject, right?
Yeah. I think it depends on so many other things, but yes, you're right. Certainly, you're right. Is the person an authority? And then you get into all the rebuttals, such as, is that a contested claim within the discipline? Are there other authorities of the discipline that contest the claim? Is there, how certain is the authority is obvious, but no, most certainly is that a knowable fact within the discipline? Is the discipline good at making prediction? The person may be a Nobel Prize of economics, but given economics track records of making predictions, I don't care. I'm being a bit facetious here, but it's a perfectly valid rebuttal. And by the way, that's another thing I wanted to get into. The counter argument to my view of making linked claims into a unit, as opposed to, like, there's the big blob, let's put all the premises together, that's Stephen's extreme, and there's, let's have each different combination of linked premise into a different object. And then we can argue about the relevance of a premise by comparing whether this premise is whether that combination of premise is a better argument than that combination of premise without that premise. And that's a way of arguing about the premise. But that's, I keep saying, oh my God, the way you're doing linked arguments is a n squared links, but mine in a way is 2 to the n combination. So that's also even more scary, much more. So I do hope that most combinations will appear, but still, that's kind of wishful thinking on my part. But what I realized is when you do rebuttals, A and B cause C, unless E or F or G or H. So are those exceptions making it more of a bigger linked premise argument, or are those kind of independent? Like, well, there's this thing that could counteract C, so of course the A and B causes C is, unless there's something else that counteracts it, which could be either of EFGH, which can exist
So that would be the
and don't need to be linked.
that would be the they both push the button because the missile fired, unless the mechanism is broken and fired on its own, right?
What I'm trying to say is there's usually a potentially infinite number of unlesses. And that way, making the unless into
right, exactly,
part of the linked argument is probably prohibitive. What I'm saying is we should be able to say, here are pros, supports, and we can then distinguish different combination of supports. And then we can say all of those are conditional to not being a rebuttal. And then here are independent rebuttals that don't need to be linked, and some of them will need to be linked, and whatever, right? Unless this and that and that. So well, that becomes a link. But linking the rebuttals with the causes creates an unreasonable need for linkage.
Yeah, the planets example is kind of one of those cases where you have there are 8 planets, there are 9 planets, there are 10 planets in our solar system, yeah. And the argument for that, the proof of the 8 is that Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus are all planets.
Those are not.
And you're obviously missing, and Pluto is not a planet, right? But there are infinite number of other planet candidates, and so there's the missing extra premise in there, and there are no other planets, right? Than those 8 I previously listed, which is indexical. But yeah, a lot of times you can have that sort of thing. Well, this because this and this, and then somebody throws in out of the blue and unless, and
yeah. And what I'm saying is the unless can become like, it's worth grouping the unless. That's what I'm saying, and making it
and there are no other planets than those 8, right? It's a grouping, yeah.
Yeah, and once you have this grouping, you're able to, and that's a compound claim actually. And then you can speak about the individual defeaters and how they fit in there.
Yep.
So what I'm saying is that means combinations exist sui generis, right? Like compound claims, like the combination of planets, combination of planes exist as a claim because they're premises in their own right, and they're contradictable, they're contestable in their own right. There's no other planet. Well, that's unless we count X as a planet, unless we count Pluto as a planet, unless we count blah 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 blah. So yeah, so I still believe in compound claims very much, but now I'm thinking compounds plus multi-premise, which I have no problem with, but then we lose canonicality. When do we use a compound? When do we use multi-premise? I don't have a good rule for that. So I'm still not happy. I'm just saying that's where I'm at. I have reasons to have canonicality. I have reasons to have multi-premise. I have reasons to have compounds. I have reasons to have multi-premise. I'm not happy about having both without a clear rule to say when to use which. That's the status of my thinking. And I think
we need a clear example.
Yeah.
We need a clear example where it has to be multi-premise.
Yeah. I'd like to leave at the hour. There's another thing I may want to attend. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have a meeting now, but they haven't called it, so I'm kind of loosely hanging on with my hard stop is becoming a soft stop, basically. Um, yeah.
Yeah, Leah's gonna go ahead
Bentley.
and call it. Yeah, go
What?
ahead.
I
No,
was
go
going to
ahead.
ask
Bye, Mark Anton.
if you already had what's her name? I have to go look
Vicky?
up her name. Vicky, yeah. If you handed that off to her to look at.
Oh, it's in the list of things to do.
Yeah.
So maybe a while before she gets to it. Although I was looking at their podcast about Weinstein. Can't remember his first name. Anyways,
Right.
and so that has some things we have to add back to our main one. So that's probably going to take priority. Yeah, now I'm trying to think of which one that was. That was because I need to add that to her. I created a task list now. I got enough stuff. I guess I just need to look in the Slack channel. Right.
Yeah, it's in there.
Yeah, I did the CDC screw up. Yeah.
Trending debates. Yeah. There's another really good one they did a few weeks back. That's reviewing the book, The End of Gender, or something like that. And they did a 2-episode review of that one, and it was pretty good. Oh, you're back?
Had the Howard wrong, sorry.
Oh, they didn't just reschedule it on you like last time.
No, I'm tired and confused.
Okay, that's acceptable. Yeah.
Yeah. What
You're talking about.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say
Well,
series...
let me just give him the background. Is just that because I think you missed when we talked about this, which was discussing taking trending topics or interesting YouTube or podcasts or something where people are trying to make a point or lots of points and break it down into essentially an argument map as a way to kind of provide relevance to the kind of stuff we're doing. And especially if you could respond to the thread of wherever that thing was posted and say, yeah, these are the arguments. And especially if you could get people to then come in and argue against it or support it or fill it out. So we were talking about that. And so Bentley created a channel that's trending debates where you could post your suggestions. And Vicky, the person he invited, has been assisting him with Gullybot stuff and other work. And so, yeah.
One thing we could do for that, which could be, I mean, okay, I heard part of that conversation, by the way. I did listen to the recording distractedly, to be honest. Is that on the one hand, there's a lot of manual work, and I'm also not that tempted to do it. We should totally team up with Jamie on that because she's getting the human power.
That's where Vicky sort of comes from. She was working with Jamie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I'm just paying her directly.
Yeah, and
so it is the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But what I would tend to do is have a basic, primitive, lossy automatic classification algorithm work on the transcripts to identify arguments about a certain problematic, and then it can totally fall within the purview of, say, Jamie's stuff, so she has a budget for it. So this would be a kind of bot that would keep aware of, hey, this argument's popping up, it falls in this purview, so let's have humans treat it. put it in the map, and then getting, as you said, and I think that's a brilliant idea, put that in the YouTube channel comments. Hey, we've put this in this map. Do you have other things to say about that map? And get people to populate the map that way. I like that. I like that plan.
Yeah.
But using automatic classification as a low-cost harvesting.
Say that again.
Using automatic classification as a low-cost harvesting technique.
You mean in some sort of automated process?
Exactly.
I don't know. Right now, my time is full as far as building processes and systems, but I have money to throw at humans to do things. So I don't think any automation is warranted until we've done it a few times.
Well,
Um,
I'm willing to spend time on automation if you're willing to throw money at me instead. But yeah, I don't know if the results.
well, humans are cheaper than certain skill sets are cheaper than others.
I know.
Right.
So
I have to
I'm a
weigh
bit more
how much is it
expensive
going to
than
cost for me to put something in as opposed to someone who I'm paying, $8 to $20 an hour, depending on where they are in the world. You can get a lot of work done.
Mechanical Turk.
Mechanical
Yeah.
Turk.
They had the right system to collect it all.
But let's say that if it's something I need to do otherwise, I might be more. I might be able to do a discount, right?
Yeah.
It's not about doing something I wouldn't do otherwise. It's about doing something I would do later. It's about shifting my priorities, which is different.
Yeah. The main thing when I think about all this stuff, I'd still like to do it manually a few times before we kind of start picking up the automation. And then Tim wants a way to kind of speed up the data entry process by having,
Yeah, I saw that.
audio right there and all that stuff. So
this is important, but not my scope.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
and
won't
actually
offer
know
to do
someone
this.
else. Yeah.
I mean,
are you
it's
talking about
one thing that's scratching my own itch too, which is why I might just do it. In spite of it maybe not being the most efficient way to get to it, it might be something I do because I want it.
Yeah.
One thing that I find very difficult in those things is often you have the classification in mind after the person started naming it. So you want to rewind to, okay, how do I rewind to the exact point where he started talking about it so I can put the mark there? That's
right. Yes, absolutely.
But again, the transcript helps with that because the transcript has time marks.
Yeah, depending on the tools, although there's lots of great transcripting tools these days.
I was thinking of the transcript implicit in YouTube.
Yeah.
But yes, there's others, I agree.
Yeah, we're not all the contents in YouTube. The podcast that Tim and I are using as a source, just because they're really good at talking about both sides of the argument. I don't think they have a YouTube version, so, and they don't do transcripts either. But yeah. Well, cool. Any other topics we want to cover today, or?
No, I got to get back to work, but I will keep thinking over this.
Yeah. Great talking to everyone.
All right. You guys have a good weekend.
You too.
You too. Bye-bye.